This is a production of Cornell University.
My stopwatch. Well, thanks for having me. So just because I thought it would be helpful to orient you, I'm on the philosophy side of the, I guess, training pendulum, though I've been pretty interdisciplinarily trained. I had climate scientists on my committee and have worked in climate economics a little bit too. So I'm going to talk to you today about why 2 degrees is too much and give a precautionary argument for a very aggressive mitigation strategy. So my plan is I'm just going to give you a little bit of background about where this project is coming out of, which is a bigger book project. And then I'm going to give you 4 arguments that lead me to a conclusion. So the first argument is about why we should take a precautionary approach to climate policy and what that should look like. The second is why the 1.5 or 2 degree target is not ambitious enough. Third, why it matters, why we're mitigating in the first place, which is something that I think is really important, so I'll try to explain. And then why temperature targets don't make sense at all, and then conclude with, well, what does make sense? And my conclusion aligns somewhat with Hanson's idea that we should be aiming for 350, just to kind of give you a sense of where I'm going. So I'm working on a book called A Climate of Risk, Precautionary Principles, Catastrophes, and Climate Change. I've been working on this book for too long. If you are one of the reviewers, if you'd turn in your review, that'd be lovely. So the book is organized into 5 kind of big chapters, which I'm just going to really briefly tell you about, because it's kind of framing what I'm doing here. So in my first chapter, I talk about how it's actually complicated, the way in which climate change is harmful, and how we have to do some theoretical work both on the scientific side and on the theoretical side to really understand what we mean when we talk about harmfulness across generations. So it's about the kind of causal and temporal complexities involved in climate change. My second chapter is called Making Sense of Precaution, in which I argue there is no one commonly shared understanding of precaution, and we need to abandon the idea that there could be a single precautionary principle that unifies all of these disparate ideas that are out in the policy literature and in the various academic literatures about precaution. And then I take that and apply it to threats of catastrophe and offer a very specific view about why we have strong moral reasons to take a precautionary approach to threats of catastrophe, and offer a decision-making framework for how we might realize that moral principle in practice in public policy. And then I have kind of, not really a digression, but an important side chapter about the economics of climate change, which I just wanted to mention since a lot of you do that. So what I'm doing in that chapter is I look at the debate between Nordhaus and Stern, and I talk about why I think Stern makes a lot of better decisions from a precautionary perspective than Nordhaus, but argue even Stern goes too far in saying he can fully incorporate precautionary concerns within an economic framework and that we don't need to go beyond that in decision making. So he thinks he can kind of roll precautionary concerns into his framework, and he does a good job of that. But I think at the end of the day, we need additional moral precautionary constraints on decision making so that we don't kind of lose sight of the moral reasons guiding us in the first place. So that will come through a little bit today. And then in my 5th chapter, I talk very specifically about what does this mean for climate policy, right? How should we be responding to the threat of climate catastrophe from a precautionary perspective? So how do we make good on this? So the paper I'm presenting today is a tiny piece of this last chapter in which I argue really against the 1.5 or 2 degree mitigation goal as being not nearly ambitious enough, right? So I'm really arguing that there's a problem in the foundation of the Paris Agreement. So the reason I give you this background is what I'd really like to come out of this workshop is a paper that's accessible to anyone, right, in academia working on climate change, to anyone in policy working on climate change. The trick is this paper builds on an entire book that's full of a lot of complicated, or at least lengthy philosophical arguments. So my goal is to communicate at least one forceful, pragmatic implication of my book, my bigger project, but a way that's accessible. So my goal is to write a paper for something like climatic change. So I thought that this would be a really good audience to kind of test this on. So in addition to content feedback, I'd love any feedback you have about ways to make this kind of work more accessible, able to be heard by a pretty wide audience. So that's my background. Okay, so my first point about a precautionary approach to climate policy. So the general idea here is that it would be better to avoid climate catastrophe, right? I think most of us in this room agree on that. What we disagree on is why we should do that and what exactly that looks like. So as I said, I argue for a precautionary approach to climate policy. But I think if I asked each one of you what the precautionary principle is, I'd probably get about two different answers. Two dozen different answers. Because I think everyone thinks they know what the precautionary principle is, but everyone has something a little bit different in mind. And I think that this is really problematic. Because in public policy, we often refer to precaution as kind of justifying various courses of action, but precaution can justify different kinds of courses of action depending on what we mean by it. So I think we need to be a lot more specific about what we mean when we say we should take a precautionary approach, and in particular, what the moral arguments are that are grounding a particular precautionary approach in a particular context. So I argue for what I call the catastrophic precautionary principle that's very narrowly targeted towards threats of catastrophe to humans. I'm going to show you what that looks like in a second. And then I have this precautionary decision-making framework I'm not going to talk about today, but I do have a kind of whole big piece about how we might try and realize this in practice. Okay, so my catastrophic precautionary principle is kind of long, but it's long for a reason. So I've gone through the very vast literature on precaution and tried to identify the major challenges that people see precautionary principles or the precautionary principle is facing. And in articulating and defending this catastrophic precautionary principle, I'm trying to avoid some of the pitfalls that are out there in the precautionary literature. So I say appropriate precautionary measures should be taken against threats of catastrophe. Where, right? So where a lot of people would think that's enough, right, to be a precautionary principle, I don't think that gives us enough action guidance. So I add a lot of caveats, right? So I define a catastrophe as threatening to severely harm many millions of people. By severe harm, I mean casualties, severe bodily harm. I don't mean cultural loss, because I think we have a separate argument there. So this is setting the bar pretty high, right? Many millions of people have to be affected for us to have a precautionary obligation to step in and try and do something. But it's much lower than some. So Posner has said a catastrophe is the end of the human race. I agree that's a catastrophe, but I think we should set the bar a little bit lower. This here I'm borrowing from our lovely Henry Shue in his Deadly Delays paper, where I say, in order to trigger the precautionary principle, we have to understand the mechanism by which the threat would be realized and have evidence that the conditions are accumulating towards the realization of that threat. So this makes it so that it doesn't apply anytime, right? We have no reason to take precautionary measures against alien invasion because we have no reason to think, right? There's no mechanism by which we think that's happening or any evidence that those conditions are accumulating, even if we could make up a mechanism. I think that precautionary measures have to not create further threats of catastrophe themselves and be aimed at, right, preventing the catastrophe in question. This is important when I talk about, for example, geoengineering as possible precautionary measures against climate change. I say that when there's an imminent threat of catastrophe or a threshold or point of no return, immediate precautionary action is warranted. So in some cases, doing more research might be a reasonable precautionary measure, right? We might be concerned that there's an asteroid that could potentially have a collision course with Earth. Okay, let's fund researchers who watch the sky and try and keep an eye out for that. In the case of climate change, we know it's imminent and there's points of no return, so we need to take immediate action. And that the likelihood of a threat might affect what kinds of measures we take, but not that we take precautionary measures. And so exactly kind of what this means is going to have to be sorted out on a case-by-case basis. And we also need to take a case-by-case approach to responsibility. So what I'm really saying here is that I can give us a really good foundation for thinking about a precautionary approach to climate policy, but we also need to bring in a lot of other moral concerns. So I don't think this is like the one principle that should guide climate policy, right? I'm building in that we have to think about responsibility. So in the case of climate change, for example, it's relevant who's contributing to climate change or who's suffering relevant harmful impacts. Okay, so that's my background. So then why is the 1.5 or 2 degree target not ambitious enough? And I've started calling it the 1.5-2 degrees, so just following the Paris Agreement, which Simon put up for us, so I didn't need to, right? That we should be aiming for 2 degrees, but it'd be better if it was 1.5 is basically what the language says. Well, the reason it's not ambitious enough is that warming already in the pipeline threatens to be catastrophically harmful. We saw some, right, John helped really establish that earlier, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit more, right? There are many millions of people already threatened to be severely harmed by climate change in actually the relatively short term, and the longer we scale out, we see that this catastrophe just really blows up, right? The potential for many, many millions or even billions of people to be severely threatened. So just quickly, the way I've set it up in this paper is, right, we're already over 400 parts per million of carbon dioxide. Even if you look at the IPCC's representative concentration pathway, that's what RCP stands for, of 2.6, which is a severely constrained mitigation pathway, right, and which involves limiting CO2 to 421 by 2100. That carries a significant risk of exceeding 1.5 or 2 degrees C target, right? That report says, right, the likely range for between 2080 and 2100, if we constrain to that degree, is between 0.3 and 1.7 degrees C. All we needed, right, is a threat that it gets above 1.5 to know that there is the possibility. And what's disturbing to me is that given, if you look closely at the IPCC language, they're actually not representing the 44% of the probability there. So there's a 44% probability we're outside that range. Let's just pretend half of that is on the high end. That's a 22% probability that we're going to be above that range, even at RCP 2.6, right? So this is problematic. We are already on a path, right? And we're well above the emissions pathway that would lead us to RCP 2.6 to be facing severe threat of catastrophic harm, right? So another way to look at this is the reasons for concern, the RFCs from the IPCC. I really like this because it just helps us visualize. So if we look at the blue line over here is the 2.6 representative concentration pathway I just described. 8.5 is basically a high emission scenario, business as usual. Maybe it's more optimistic than business as usual, I would argue. We see that what's important is we not just look at the blue line, but we look at the full potential uncertainty range for what kinds of temperature outcomes we're going to see. So a few things to notice here. One, this graph cuts off at 2100. But already by 2100, we're seeing there's a significant risk of going more than 2 degrees C above pre-industrial levels. And what's really important is that if we correlate that to my favorite burning embers diagrams, my favorite IPCC image, is that we see that there's significant risk in every category. There's significant risk to unique and threatened systems. And we rely on unique and threatened systems for our survival, right? So that is potentially severely harmful. Extreme weather events, I think this is even conservative if we look at new data, that the risks are probably much more severe even earlier. And we're already in the risk zone for extreme weather events that threaten to be catastrophically harmful, melting of ice sheets, major disruptive storms. Disruption of impacts is going to be a problem. Many, many millions of people around the world are going to be affected by more local impacts. Anyways, I think this just illustrates really quickly that we're already at significant risk, even at current levels of catastrophic risk of harm. So to say that 1.5 or 2 degrees C should be our goal in mitigation is to accept a path that I think is morally problematic, right? We have very strong moral reasons to be aiming much higher, in other words, much lower in terms of temperature. So I think the world is going down the wrong path by so strongly clinging to this notion of 1.5 or 2 degrees C. So why does it matter why we're mitigating in the first place? This is connected to that last point. So here's a question, right? Isn't the Paris Agreement, or a 1.5, 2 degrees C target, a good step forward? I'm sure some of you are thinking that, right? Isn't it a good step forward? It's a good place to start. Yeah, maybe it doesn't meet your moral criteria, but we got to start somewhere. This seems like a great step forward. My answer is no, because it's not good enough, right? To embrace that as our goal is to abandon what morality is telling us we ought to be doing. So a 1.5 or 2 degree Celsius mitigation target poses morally inappropriate risks, I think, both on ourselves and future generations. If you look at the data, right, within my lifetime, within my son's lifetime, I think that many millions of people will be severely harmed. I care about all people now and into the far future, like most of my philosophical colleagues here. So when you think about it that way, this target is just not acceptable. A way of thinking about this that draws on the work of my colleague Steve Gardner from the University of Washington is to think of the 1.5, 2 degree target as being morally corrupt. So what does this mean? Steve Gardner has this idea that one of the challenges of climate change is that it's so daunting to deal with, right? It's so daunting to take on from a moral perspective, from a policy perspective, from a practical perspective, that we're going to be tempted into acting in ways that we might think are ethical, but that are in fact unethical. This is the concept of moral corruption. So the idea here is that we think we're doing this great thing by endorsing Paris and by latching on to this 2°C target, when in fact we're just deluding ourselves, right? We think, oh, that's a great step forward, but it's not, because we are basically locking in significant risk of catastrophe, both to ourselves and future people, right? So it sets us on this ethically inappropriate course of action. To just give this idea a little traction, something I use when I teach a lot is like, imagine your neighbor like bikes to the farmer's market on Earth Day and like buys all this local produce and is like, oh yeah, I'm green, right? And make sure everyone sees him. And he's like, okay, I've done it for the year. I'm just gonna go get in my car and drive to Costco every other day and live my life, but I've done my duty. I've done my green thing. I'm being green enough, right? This is the kind of moral corruption that Steve Gardner is worried about and that I'm worried about. Right? It's easy to say, well, I'm just going to, do this little thing, when in fact, doing that little thing makes it more likely that the thing we know we ought to be avoiding in the first place is going to happen. Okay, talk more about that maybe in a second. Okay, so the fourth point then is that it doesn't make sense to be talking about temperature targets in the first place. So in a way, this actually should have been the first point, but made more sense to put it last. So temperature targets let us think in terms of impacts, right? So if we go back to the burning embers diagram, we like temperature targets because we can look at a diagram like this and think, okay, 2 degrees, these risks. But what's problem is that a significant problem here is that by thinking in terms of a temperature target, we're masking all kinds of uncertainties. For example, many people say they endorse the 2-degree target. But what they really mean is that they want to endorse a pathway that gives us a 50% chance of staying below 2 degrees. And that's based on a whole bunch of science that doesn't incorporate a whole bunch of genuine uncertainties, which I brought up in a session earlier. So to talk in terms of degrees makes it seem as if we can just choose a course that puts us at a perfect point on a graph, right? Lets us think in terms of lines. But that's not how the world works here. So I think it's really problematic for us to focus on temperature targets when what we really should be talking about is risk and uncertainty. So we need a way of talking about mitigation that isn't going to immediately, again, corrupt us into thinking we have control over a situation that we don't. And yes, maybe a lot of us know about all the uncertainty that goes behind a temperature target. But I don't think many policymakers do, and certainly the general public doesn't. Right? So how certain do we need to be that a mitigation pathway will keep us below a given temperature? 50%, 99%? This is going to be really tricky to figure out. So an alternative, right, is a greenhouse gas concentration target. This is a little tricky because we should be talking about all greenhouse gases, not just CO2. But at least by talking about a concentration target, we have something to aim for. But we might even want to take a step back and think in terms of radiative forcing targets, right? And think about what do we actually want in terms of what do we think would be a morally acceptable goal in terms of radiative forcing. The IPCC's representative concentration pathways, I think, bring us somewhere in between, right? They're trying to model radiative forcing and concentration targets. And part of what is being masked even in kind of the various proposals here is that it doesn't just matter what the temperature target or what the concentration target is or what the radiative forcing target is, but it matters how quickly we get there, right? So there's this time element that gets masked in a lot of our discussion of targets. But I think we need to be much more careful from a precautionary perspective to make sure that we're really thinking about risk and uncertainty and both the practical and moral implications of risk and uncertainty. And by talking in terms of a temperature target, we're kind of going down this slippery slope of avoiding dealing head-on with the issues that we should be dealing with. Okay, so to kind of bring this all together, just to walk through it as a whole, I've given you a very quick first pass at why I think we should be taking a precautionary approach to climate policy. Quite simply, many millions of people dying would be bad, right? If there were to be, we had good evidence that there was going to be a volcanic eruption and many millions of people would die, I think we'd have a moral obligation to step in and take some precautionary measures against that. for similar reasons, we've got really good evidence that we're going on down a path that's going to lead to catastrophic harm. We should be stepping in to do something about that. I think the moral argument there is pretty simple. Which means that 1.5 and 2 degrees C is not ambitious enough, right? This target poses threats of catastrophic harm. That's morally inappropriate. And I think it matters that we pay attention to why we're mitigating in the first place, because if we don't, we're just being tempted down this path of moral corruption. So we need to keep in mind as we write, as we frame, as we fight for climate mitigation, why we're doing this in the first place. And I think if you look closely at the language in the Paris Agreement, it really endorses 1.5 or 2 degrees C as a morally appropriate target. This is where the language matters, but I think there's a very easy way to read the Paris Agreement as saying this is good enough, this is what we should be aiming for. But if our real goal is to avoid climate catastrophe, that's the moral motivation, Paris isn't getting us there. And everyone's wanting to latch on to Paris because it's letting us avoid the really devastating fact that we're failing to meet our moral obligation to address climate change, right? And where that is more than about just mitigation. So I called people out on adaptation. So in my book, I talk a lot about how another implication of this is we need to be doing a lot to enable adaptation right now and into the future around the world, and assess complementary strategies, but that's for another time, right? So we need to shift to talking about mitigation in some other way, and I think that dialogue needs to evolve a little bit, but definitely away from temperature targets, because that's really hiding all of the uncertainty involved in our understanding of the climate system and in our understanding of how we can get to some alternate future, right, in which we don't see these catastrophic risks. So looking through the literature, the only conclusion I can really come to is that I should be aligning myself with James Hansen and saying 350 should be our target, right? That seem practically challenging to get to? Absolutely. But morally, that's what our target ought to be. And I think we have to be aiming at what we ought to be aiming at in order to avoid a pathway that's going to make it more and more likely that we morally fail as a generation to address climate change, right? So my slogan here is we need to aim higher to stay lower. So I intentionally kept it short so we could have some more discussion, but that's all I have for now.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.